In this video, we're going to discuss the bean scopes available in Spring. So what exactly are scopes? Well, a scope refers to the life cycle of a bean. For example, it tells you how long the bean will live, how many instances will be created, and also how is the bean shared in the Spring environment. So the default scope for a bean is singleton. So here's an example here of just some bean code that we had earlier, and we didn't explicitly give a scope. So by default, the scope is singleton. But now you're probably wondering, well, what exactly is a singleton? We know it's the default scope, but what is it? Well, for a singleton, the Spring container creates only one instance of the bean. It's cached in memory, and then all requests for that bean will return a shared reference to the same bean. So the end result is that there's only one bean and everyone will share it. Here's a nice diagram to kind of show you this example. In this example, we have the coach equals context.getBean, my coach, and it'll give you a reference to like a track coach that you have defined. And then later on in the code, if you would also do a similar thing saying context.getBean, my coach, the same bean ID, then it'll basically give you a reference to the same bean. We have these two object references here, and they point to the same area of memory, or they point to the same bean. So again, Spring makes use of a singleton. It'll create only one bean and then share it for everyone who requests that bean. So the singleton scope is default, and the best use case for this is for a stateless bean, where you don't need to maintain any state. You can explicitly specify the bean scope. I mean, by now you know that by default you have the singleton scope, but if you want to explicitly specify it, then you make use of the scope attribute. So you say scope equals singleton, and that'll make it a singleton bean. And that's kind of the preferred approach to minimize the number of beans that are created. But now there are additional Spring bean scopes that you can make use of. We've already covered singleton. There's also the prototype scope, which creates a new bean instance for each container request, and we'll see examples of that coming up, and we'll also use that as a demo in the video coming up. Then the next three items here, request, session, and global session, these scopes are only used in a web environment. So request is for a given web request, session is for a HTTP web session for like session tracking for like maybe a shopping cart or something. And then global session is scoped application wide. But we'll talk more about these later when we get into the Spring MVC section. But for now, we'll simply focus on singleton and prototype. So here's an example of using prototype scope. So again, remember prototype scope, a new object is created for each request. So in this example here, I have my bean ID of my coach, and I have scope equals prototype. So that means that every time I make a request for this my coach, they'll create a new instance each time. So a nice little diagram here. So the line of code at the top, the coach equals context get bean my coach. It'll create a new instance of that bean. I'll get a reference to it. And then a similar thing here when I say alpha coach equals context.getBean my coach. It'll create a new object for you, and you'll have your own reference. So the prototype scope is good for keeping track of stateful data. So again, whenever you see prototype, just think of the new keyword. It's going to create a new bean for each request for that component or that object. All right, so this is some really good stuff. Let's go ahead and move forward in the next videos. We're going to dive into Eclipse, and we'll actually write some code that'll make use of the singleton scope and the prototype scope so you can see everything in action. Alrighty, I'll see you in the next video.